everyone. I'm Trish, and we are thrilled to be here and kicking off this first part of a two-part series that we'll be doing with the group. I do love the front slide that was there because it shows a plane that's really intact. And what we've been saying since the beginning of this, and many of you, I'm sure, in your communities and around the country have used that phrase of we're building the plane while we're flying it, as we're trying to figure out and navigate how to live within a public health emergency and how to mobilize our communities. But we've reached a place where we are really getting ready to take off. And this afternoon will really all be about understanding some of the work we've been doing around community-led vaccinations, engaging community, and really finding ways to be impactful and make a difference. So we were thrilled to get the feedback from everyone around the vaccine clinics that you might have done in your community and some of the questions that you had, how best to reach rural populations, how to engage in vaccine efforts, find vaccinators, and all of those things. So hopefully we'll be able to answer your questions throughout this. But for those of you who are not familiar with Wisconsin, I noticed that there are a couple of Midwesterners on the call, and we're also joined by our new health director. Appleton is part of the Fox Cities area. We're in Northeast Wisconsin, and for those of you who are Packer fans, we're just a little bit south of Green Bay. For those of you who are Magic fans, we are also home to Harry Houdini and the Houdini Museum. But most importantly, we are home to a growing and diverse community of people who came to this area based on the river to build factories and paper. But today, really people who have come to build their community, build their families, and work together around equity. As we look at the challenges that our community faced pre-pandemic, we recently got our new census data that showed that there was a huge increase in diverse populations coming to an area that traditionally had not been so diverse. And as we look at the data, we really find that this gives us a roadmap in where we want to go in the communities that we'd like to embrace. So I'd like to turn back time a little bit to everyone's kind of frame of reference when the pandemic began, March of 2020, when we were hit with the you must shelter at home and how are we going to do this and masking and watching the TV, and it's fairly traumatizing to go back to those moments to think about where we were in a bit of paralysis of what to do and how to respond. One of the things that our community is very experienced in and very proud of is that we come together. We come together with solutions that focus on problems that are in front of us. And the pandemic was very similar to that. In the past, we looked at infant mortality or tobacco control or other issues, but they were still very surface because they didn't hit everyone. The pandemic hit everyone. So when we came together as what we called the community solutions team, we recognized that we needed to address emerging need and very urgent community need. There was a bit of, well, panic, but also a bit of strategy and a lot of commitment to say, what can we do as a community to meet the needs of our most vulnerable populations? And at that time in the beginning, it was really the elderly or people who were at home or people with kids. What were we going to do with food? How were we going to address transportation issues if people needed to get to the pharmacy to get their medication? What about healthcare? What about people losing their jobs? How are we going to really begin to bring this together? So we had a marching order. We're in it together, stronger than ever, and everyone comes up with these sort of battle cries. But we were very committed to this work, and our Community United Way brought a group together. Hospitals, public health, hunger relief, many different nonprofits, the ecumenical community, our transportation resources, ourselves as a federally qualified community health center, different governments and counties to really begin to address what are the needs going to be in this new world that we're living in. As the result of our work began, we knew we needed to figure out strategies for pharmacy, particularly getting that to people. Figuring out what transportation's resources were still in place. Could you still ride the bus? How was that going to impact people? Knowing that many people in our community were immediately losing their jobs, and if they were losing their jobs, what were they doing without health insurance? How were we going to mitigate that? How are we going to move people together so we could really begin to address these issues? Well, as a community, we have a wealth of info. We have spreadsheets, we have data banks, we have people, we work with 211, we had a hub that was Give Help, Get Help. But what we recognized, and this was not a new piece for us to recognize, but was highly illuminated within the beginning of the pandemic, is that the communication out to the people who needed it the most, the people who were disproportionately affected and impacted by COVID, were our communities of color, our non-English speaking populations, people in rural areas. And how were we really going to get that information out to them? Because we were doing it as sort of business as usual. We knew how to get info out there and how to mobilize, but we didn't know how to get deeper into the community as a collective. At that same time, many things were bubbling up with civil unrest in our own country, with Asian hate and the murder, and many other things that were happening. And how then do we begin to look at equitable food systems and equitable prevention and information out to people without changing things up, without shaking the system and saying, wow, we have a portion of our community who is now connected to this stuff, but those who need it most are not. So as our community access team looked at these issues, there was a moment where we knew that we really needed to expand and connect and mobilize with our communities of color. And at that beginning, it was, wow, could we just get something translated? And knowing that the depth of the people on this call know that it is so much more than a flyer or putting it in the language or even looking at the health literacy. We needed to figure out a way to move forward and engage and connect with people where they were at the grassroots level, to impact not only from the prevention standpoint, the mitigation of COVID, but then getting resources to those people who need it the most and wait for vaccination. This was all we were on the cusp of what was going to happen next. We really believe that during this time, and I think many people felt this way, with crisis comes opportunity. There's no time like the present. You can plan and work plan and have a strategy, but until it needs to get put into action with urgency and competency, like what happened in March 2020, that's when we really needed to act. And that at the genesis was the beginning of the Multicultural Coalition, really as we came together, not only just to make sure we had equitable communication, because that was really our beginning point, but that we were able to address the needs of our most vulnerable populations. But in order to address needs, we need to build trust. We need to build community. We need to find ways to look at these inequities, not with my lens of how I saw an inequity, but with the lens of the people who were living this and going back to the grassroots to understand that those closest to the problem are those closest to the solution. When I reflect on this picture, this was the first time that we brought our diverse communities together with our Secretary-elect Karen Timberlake at the state level to really identify what the challenges were and what was needed. It wasn't like we just needed a grant. We just need funds. No, we needed a change. We needed revolution in a lot of ways to really shake this up so we could not just feel like we were doing the right thing, but that we were doing this in conjunction and with a compassionate eye, but with a new way of really beginning to address the challenges in our community as it's related to COVID.
Thank you, Trish. And I will hop in and I want to reiterate how important it is for this group on today's call to understand how we came to be, because we set the foundation for the work that we were going to continue to do into the future. So when we talk about with crisis comes an opportunity, I will tell you personally, I was challenged in terms of facing the pandemic, running a small business, children, a husband on the front lines. And personally, I was challenged, and I thought, I want to be able to do something. And Trish used one of my favorite words, revolution. That's how I felt at the time when Trish and others in the community came and said, we need to do a better job of reaching our communities of color. So for those who are not familiar with my background, I also do quite a bit in crisis management. So this is, every which way you looked at it was a crisis. So we started to take a look around at our community. I have lived in this community for more than 20 years, understand it intimately, both as an outsider and as a person who belongs in the community. So one of the things that we knew going into this work, and we didn't know that we were going to fast forward to vaccination clinics, but at this time we knew we needed to build trust. This was critically important to set the table with trust. And if you're in a small town community like we are, with a number of communities around, there's vulnerable populations, communities of color, we knew we had to start at a place that we had to make the assumption there is no trust. There is no trust between public health and communities of color. There is no trust with the general population. So how can we start to build trust? So one of the first things we did, and again, this is after researching what other highly populated metro areas were doing. And I took a look at what others were doing. And I thought this won't work in our community. So one of the first things we did is look at those community leaders from the communities of color and pull them and ask them to be a part of our virtual table. And then from there, we looked at all the public health entities. They were invited to be at this table. We looked at other nonprofits. They were invited to be at this virtual table. And again, to set the stage, you know how this world has been operating at a virtual level. So we actually began meeting way back early in the pandemic, and it was about building trust. And I can't say that enough. And in order to build trust, you need to be vulnerable. I always say you need to check your ego and you need to bring your heart. So that's what we were doing around our virtual table, bringing people together to get to know one another and to build relationships. We didn't know at the time, when you talk about building the plane as you're flying it, we didn't know at the time where we were going, but we knew we needed to do better. And a first place to start was communications. So there are so many barriers we're going to talk about in identification of barriers when it comes to communications that were existing in our communities, and we needed to do it better. And in order to do it better, we need to be better as human beings, and we need to look at this from those people we were trying to serve, our most vulnerable populations. So again, we talk about the Multicultural Coalition. So really a community-based organization with, at any given point, I think we've had meetings where there's been 50 people sitting around the virtual table. There's been 100 people sitting around the virtual table. But the goal was to create a safe space and to build trust. And I cannot say that enough. Sorry, I have to flip my own slides here, so it gets a little goofy. So when we talk about the Multicultural Coalition today, we still have so many partners sitting around the table with us today in the work that we're doing. So we started out as a communications committee, really focused on how can we do communications better and how can we build trust between all the community members that are represented around our table. And one thing I really want to make sure that is very apparent, this is not about me sitting at the table or others sitting at the table talking and saying what needs to be done. This is about communication, and that means that's a two-way street. It's about listening to what our most vulnerable populations are saying, and then figuring out a course of action with all of us together. This is really, really important. And I have no doubt that many of you, all of you on this phone call understand that. But we're not talking about a top-down approach. We are talking from grassroots on up. And in order to do that, again, it's check your ego, bring your heart, and open your ears to listen to what is being said. And again, we were meeting it was like once a week in the beginning. And it made checking your pride, being humble, and listening to the areas that needed to be improved in our community so we could do better and be better as human beings. So today, you'll see this slide right now. It represents what I lovingly call our dream team. And so the Multicultural Coalition, we have since become an incorporation. We are currently working on filing for our 501c3. But these are all board members. We have Oladimeji Tamori from Pointers Community Initiative. We have Trish from Partnership. We have Ernie from Casa Hispana. We have Dr. Pam from New Monk Professionals, all represented around the table, and so many other grassroots organizations, because again, this is grassroots going up, not a top-down approach. So one of the things we talked about, and you have heard, and I witnessed, and I can't believe I lived as how I have for the first 50 years of my life. The pandemic exposed so many cracks in the system, the cracks in the community. And I really started to look at what needed to be done. And oh my gosh, the underserved communities weren't being served, especially at this critical time. And I tell you all of this because this is part of my process and part of the committee's process of moving through all the barriers and discovery process and the listening sessions that took place and the vulnerable conversations that took place for us to get at the table together equitably to figure out then what were the solutions that needed to happen as we moved forward.